Captain David Chen had attended diplomatic functions on 17 different worlds, but he'd never encountered anyone quite like Ambassador Kira Velthara. She stood at the edge of the crossroad station reception, perfectly composed in the flowing silver robes that marked her as a representative of the Vailnari Empire, her pale blue skin seeming to absorb the station's artificial lighting rather than reflect it. Everything about her projected untouchable elegance, the way she held herself with regal precision, the measured cadence of her responses to other diplomats, the careful smile that never quite reached her luminous golden eyes. She was, by any measure, the most diplomatically successful representative the Vailnari had ever sent to neutral space. She was also, David realized as he watched her navigate the social gathering, completely and utterly alone. "Impressive, isn't she?" commented Ambassador Torres from the Centauri delegation. 3 years of negotiations and she's never lost her composure once. The Vailnari certainly know how to breed perfect diplomats. David studied Kira more carefully, noting details that others seemed to miss. The way her hands remained perfectly still at her sides, as if any spontaneous gesture might betray something she couldn't afford to reveal. How she maintained exactly the same distance from every conversation partner, never allowing anyone to get too close. The practiced way she deflected any question that ventured beyond professional topics. "Has anyone ever seen her outside these formal functions?" David asked. "Why would you want to? The woman's practically a machine. Polite, efficient, completely professional." Torres shrugged. "Perfect for a species that prides itself on emotional control." David watched Kira conclude a conversation with the Andromedan trade representative with flawless courtesy, then move to the next diplomatic cluster with mechanical precision. But as she turned, he caught something in her expression, a flicker of, what? Exhaustion? Longing? It was gone so quickly he might have imagined it. "Ambassador Velthara," David said, approaching her position near the station's main viewport. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. Captain David Chen, Earth Diplomatic Corps." Kira turned to face him with that same measured smile, but David noticed that she automatically stepped back slightly, maintaining her precise social distance. "Captain Chen. I have reviewed your credentials. Your reputation for successful cultural integration protocols is quite impressive." "Thank you. I have to say, your own diplomatic achievements speak for themselves. 3 years of maintaining peace between species that were on the brink of war when you arrived. Successful negotiations are simply a matter of understanding each party's actual objectives and finding mutually beneficial arrangements." Her response was perfectly professional, but David caught the way her golden eyes briefly focused on something beyond the viewport, the endless stars that surrounded their small outpost of civilization. "Is that how the Vailnari approach all relationships? Through mutual benefit analysis?" For just a moment, Kira's composed expression flickered. "Relationships are not a concept that translates well across species, Captain Chen. The Vailnari focus on functional partnerships that serve broader purposes." That sounds rather clinical. Efficiency is a virtue. But something in her tone suggested she was reciting a lesson rather than expressing a belief. David gestured toward the stars beyond the viewport. "Do you ever miss home, Ambassador? 3 years is a long assignment, even for someone with your diplomatic skills." Kira's golden eyes met his briefly, and David saw something vulnerable flash across her features before the diplomatic mask reasserted itself. The Vailnari do not experience homesickness as humans understand the concept. We adapt to whatever environment serves our purpose. And what about personal connection? Friendship? Do those translate across species? Personal connections can compromise objectivity, Kira replied, but her voice carried less conviction than her earlier responses. Effective diplomacy requires maintaining appropriate professional distance from all parties. David noticed that her hands had begun to tremble almost imperceptibly, so slightly that anyone not watching carefully would have missed it entirely. "That sounds like a lonely way to live." The word lonely hit Kira like a physical blow. Her composure wavered for just an instant, and David saw a raw pain flash across her features before she regained control. "Loneliness is not a condition that affects the Valnari," she said stiffly. "We are complete within ourselves. Are you?" The simple question seemed to cause her actual distress. She turned away from him, her attention fixed on the viewport with desperate intensity. "Captain Chen, I should return to the reception. There are several matters requiring diplomatic attention." "Of course. Perhaps we could continue this conversation sometime when you're not on duty." "I am always on duty." The words came out with such finality that David understood they weren't just about her professional obligations. As Kira moved away from him with that same measured grace, David watched her rejoin the diplomatic gathering. To any casual observer, she appeared unchanged, poised, professional, completely in control. But David had seen the crack in her facade, the moment when something real and desperately vulnerable had looked out through her golden eyes. The reception continued around them, but David found himself studying Kira throughout the evening. He noticed how she never quite relaxed, never let her guard down, never allowed any conversation to venture into personal territory. She was perfectly diplomatic with everyone and genuinely connected to no one. When the function finally ended, David watched the other diplomats leave in groups, chatting casually as they made their way back to their quarters. Kira left alone, walking with the same measured pace she'd maintained all evening, declining the few polite invitations to extend the social gathering. David followed at a distance, not to intrude but simply to observe. He watched her enter her quarters in the diplomatic section, noting how quickly the doors sealed behind her, not just closing, but sealing with the kind of security locks that suggested she was either protecting something valuable or hiding from something dangerous. Standing in the empty corridor outside her quarters, David reflected on what he'd witnessed. Ambassador Kira Velthara was the most successful diplomat on Crossroads Station, respected by all and trusted by many. She was also, unless David was very much mistaken, the loneliest person he'd ever encountered. The question was whether that loneliness was cultural programming or personal prison, and whether someone who had spent 3 years maintaining perfect diplomatic distance would ever allow another person close enough to find out. David made his way back to his own quarters, thinking about golden eyes that had briefly shown him something real beneath layers of cultural conditioning and professional necessity. Tomorrow, he decided, he was going to find out more about the woman behind Ambassador Velthara's perfect mask. Even if it meant risking the careful diplomatic relationships that kept peace in this small corner of the galaxy. David spent the next morning researching Valnari culture, accessing diplomatic databases and cultural studies that painted a picture of a society built on emotional suppression. What he discovered explained much about Kira's behavior, and made it far more troubling. The Valnari had evolved as telepathic empaths, naturally sensitive to the emotions of those around them. But rather than embracing this gift, their society had developed elaborate cultural mechanisms to suppress emotional expression entirely. Children were taught from birth that showing vulnerability, admitting need, or expressing personal desires was a fundamental character weakness that marked them as defective. Emotional contamination, David read from a xenosociology text, is considered the greatest threat to Valnari social stability. Individuals who display excessive empathy or emotional responsiveness are isolated from the general population to prevent the spread of their condition to others. David stared at the screen, beginning to understand the prison Kira lived within. Her perfect diplomatic composure wasn't cultural pride, it was survival. Any display of genuine emotion could mark her as defective by her own people's standards. He was still reviewing cultural data when his communication system chimed with an incoming message from Kira herself. "Captain Chen, I would appreciate the opportunity to clarify our conversation from yesterday evening. Perhaps you would join me for tea in the diplomatic garden at your convenience." David smiled despite the formal language. The diplomatic garden was the station's most private meeting area, designed for sensitive conversations that required discretion. He found Kira waiting by the artificial waterfall that provided acoustic cover for private discussions. She had prepared tea with the same meticulous precision she brought to everything else, but David noticed that her hands weren't quite steady as she poured. "Captain Chen, I believe I may have given you an incorrect impression about Veilnari cultural practices, she began without preamble. In what way? When you asked about loneliness, I responded as if the concept were completely foreign to my people. That was inaccurate. Kira's golden eyes fixed on the teacup in her hands. We do experience such feelings. We are simply trained not to acknowledge or express them. Trained not to, or forbidden to. Kira was quiet for a long moment. The distinction is not always clear. David sipped his tea, noting its complex flavor and the care with which it had been prepared. This is excellent. Did you learn tea ceremony as part of your diplomatic training? No. It was a personal interest from before my assignment here. For the first time since he'd met her, Kira's voice carried a hint of something beyond professional courtesy. My grandmother taught me when I was very young, before I began formal education. What was she like? She was. Kira paused, as if the question required careful consideration. She was kind. Patient. She had a way of making even the most ordinary moments feel special. Her expression grew wistful. She was also considered emotionally unstable by our community standards. Because she was kind. Because she expressed affection openly. Because she found joy in simple pleasures. Because she treated emotional connection as valuable rather than dangerous. Kira's voice grew quiet. She died when I was 12. The isolation requirements had damaged her health. David felt something cold settle in his stomach. Isolation requirements? Individuals who display excessive emotional responses are separated from general society to prevent contamination of others. It's considered a mercy. They're provided with comfortable living conditions and all necessary resources. Kira's hands trembled more visibly now. They simply aren't allowed contact with anyone who might be affected by their emotional instability. They're exiled for having feelings. They're protected from causing harm to others through their inability to maintain appropriate emotional control. But Kira's tone suggested she was repeating doctrine rather than expressing belief. David studied her face, noting the careful way she avoided meeting his eyes. Kira, why are you really here on Crossroad Station? The question seemed to cause her physical distress. She set down her teacup with trembling hands and stared at the artificial waterfall with desperate intensity. I am here to represent Veilnari interests in neutral space negotiations, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. That's your official assignment. Why are you really here? Captain Chen, I should return to my duties. This conversation has become inappropriately personal. Has it? Or has it become honest for the first time? Kira stood abruptly, her composed facade cracking under the pressure of questions she couldn't safely answer. I cannot, this discussion is not appropriate for diplomatic personnel. We're not diplomat and ambassador right now, Kira. We're just two people talking over tea. I am never just a person, she replied, and the pain in her voice was so raw that David felt it like a physical blow. I am always a representative, always a symbol, always being evaluated for signs of. She stopped abruptly, as if she'd been about to reveal something dangerous. Signs of what? Nothing. Forget I spoke. Kira gathered her composure like armor, but David could see the effort it required. Captain Chen, I must ask that you not repeat this conversation to anyone. My effectiveness as a diplomat depends on maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. Your secret is safe with me. There is no secret. There is only the requirement to maintain proper Veilnari dignity in all interactions. But as she said it, a single tear traced down her pale blue cheek before she could stop it. She wiped it away quickly, her golden eyes wide with what looked like panic. I should go. Kira, wait. But she was already leaving, walking with quick, precise steps that suggested someone fleeing danger rather than concluding a social visit. David sat in the garden for a long time after she left, staring at the tea set she'd prepared with such care. The conversation had revealed more than Kira had intended, not just about her culture's cruel emotional suppression, but about her own desperate isolation. That evening, David made discreet inquiries about Kira's assignment to Crossroads Station. What he learned made everything worse. "She's been here 3 years, confirmed Station Administrator Walsh. Longest single assignment any Valnari diplomat has ever served. Usually they rotate every 18 months to prevent, what did they call it? Excessive cultural contamination. Why is she different? According to the official communications, she's so effective at her job that her government wants to maximize her contribution to peaceful relations." Walsh paused. "Unofficially? I get the impression she's not going home anytime soon." David felt that cold feeling in his stomach intensify. What kind of impression? The kind where someone's assignment gets extended indefinitely without explanation, and their government stops sending the usual diplomatic support messages. Walsh looked uncomfortable. "Captain, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but Ambassador Velthora hasn't received any personal communications from her homeworld in over 18 months. That night, David lay awake thinking about golden eyes that had briefly shown him pain so deep that acknowledging it had caused physical distress. About a woman who prepared tea with her grandmother's ceremony but hadn't spoken to her family. David's investigation into Kira's real situation began with diplomatic communication logs that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. What he found wasn't just abandonment, it was systematic isolation disguised as professional assignment. The official records showed Ambassador Velthora as a highly valued representative whose successful negotiations had prevented 3 potential wars and established profitable trade relationships for 17 different species. Her diplomatic achievements were genuinely remarkable. The personal communication logs told a different story entirely. Captain Chen. Station Administrator Walsh appeared at David's shoulder while he reviewed classified files. "You've been accessing Valnari diplomatic archives for 3 hours. Is there something specific you're looking for?" Trying to understand Ambassador Velthora's assignment parameters, David replied carefully. "Some of the cultural protocols seem unusual." Walsh sat down across from him, his expression troubled. "David, I'm going to tell you something that's not in any official report. Kira Velthora isn't here as an honored diplomat. She's here as a punishment." David felt his suspicions crystallizing into horrible certainty. "What kind of punishment?" "According to communications I've intercepted, and this stays between us, she was recalled from her previous assignment for showing excessive cultural sympathy toward other species. The Valnari consider that a form of mental instability. Cultural sympathy. She prevented a war by understanding both sides' emotional needs instead of just their strategic objectives. She negotiated a peace treaty by acknowledging that the other species had valid feelings about territorial disputes." Walsh pulled up the classified files David had been reviewing. By Valnari standards, treating other beings' emotions as legitimate concerns made her mentally compromised. David stared at the communication logs, seeing 3 years of isolation in a new light. So they sent her here to keep her away from important negotiations. They sent her here to keep her away from their society entirely. Look at this. Walsh highlighted a communication from 6 months ago. The Valnari High Council refers to her assignment as therapeutic isolation pending emotional stabilization. They're not planning to bring her home, David. They're hoping the isolation will cure her of caring about other people. And if it doesn't? Walsh was quiet for a moment. There are references to more intensive therapeutic interventions if her condition doesn't improve. David felt sick. They're talking about the same kind of isolation that killed her grandmother. You know about that? She mentioned it yesterday. Walsh, what happens if I intervene? If I try to help her? Officially? Nothing. Kira's assignment here is legitimate, and how she conducts her personal relationships is her own business. Walsh hesitated. Unofficially, the Valnari government has been monitoring her interactions for signs of further emotional instability. If they think she's forming inappropriate attachments. David understood the implication. Any genuine friendship or emotional connection Kira formed would be used as evidence that her condition was worsening rather than improving. That evening, David found Kira in the station's observation lounge, standing alone at the main viewport. She'd been there for 2 hours, according to the duty officer, just staring out at the stars with an expression of profound loneliness. "Beautiful view," David said, joining her at the viewport. "I find stellar observation calming," Kira replied, but her voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with astronomical interest. "Do you ever wonder what's out there? Beyond the trade routes and diplomatic territories? Speculation about unknown regions is not a productive use of time." But David noticed that her golden eyes tracked the distant stars with a longing that contradicted her practical words. "Kira, can I ask you something personal?" She tensed immediately. Personal questions are not appropriate for diplomatic relationships. What if we weren't diplomats right now? What if we were just two people who happened to meet on a space station? That is not possible. I am always a representative of my people. Even when you're alone in your quarters. Even when you're staring out at stars that no Valnari has ever seen. Kira turned away from the viewport, her composure beginning to crack under the pressure of questions that touched too close to forbidden truths. "Captain Chen, why are you asking these questions?" David made a choice that would change everything between them. "Because I think you're the loneliest person I've ever met, and I think your people put you here not to represent them, but to hide you." The words hit Kira like a physical blow. Her careful composure shattered entirely, revealing raw pain and desperate vulnerability that she'd been hiding for years. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't. I'm not allowed to." "Not allowed to what?" "To want things. To miss home. To wish I could talk to someone without calculating the diplomatic implications of every word." Tears began streaming down her pale blue cheeks. "To admit that I haven't spoken to another Valnari in 18 months because they're afraid my emotional instability might contaminate them." David felt his heart breaking for this brilliant, caring woman who'd been punished for the very qualities that made her an exceptional diplomat. "Kira, there's nothing wrong with having emotions. There is for me. For my people." She wiped at her tears frantically, as if someone might see her crying and use it as evidence against her. "Do you know what my last evaluation said? That I showed dangerous levels of empathy and concerning attachment to non-Valnari welfare. That sounds like someone describing an outstanding diplomat. It sounds like someone describing a mentally defective individual who needs therapeutic intervention." Kira's voice grew bitter. "I prevented a war by caring about the people who would die in it. I negotiated peace by understanding what each side actually needed instead of what they claimed to want. And for that, my own people decided I was too damaged to remain in their society." David moved closer to her, noting how she instinctively stepped back even while yearning for connection. "Kira, what would happen if you just stopped pretending? If you let yourself be honest about what you feel?" "I would be recalled immediately for intensive emotional reconditioning. A process that would eliminate my capacity for empathy entirely." Her golden eyes met his with desperate intensity. "I would become exactly what my people want me to be, perfectly controlled, completely rational, incapable of caring about anyone or anything beyond Valnari interests." "And you'd rather live in exile than become that?" "I'd rather die than become that." The admission seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised David. "But I can't die, and I can't go home, and I can't let myself care about anyone because caring is what got me exiled in the first place." They stood in silence for several minutes, the weight of her impossible situation hanging between them like a physical presence. "Kira," David said finally, "what if you didn't have to choose between caring and survival? There is no alternative. My people's decision is final. What if your people's decision is wrong?" She stared at him with something that might have been hope mixed with terror. "Captain Chen, what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that maybe the most empathetic diplomat in the galaxy doesn't need to be fixed. Maybe she needs to be appreciated." "By whom?" "I am the only Valnari in neutral space, and I am forbidden from returning home. David took a step closer to her, close enough to see the pain and longing she'd been hiding behind diplomatic courtesy. By people who understand that empathy isn't a disease, it's a gift. By friends who value emotional intelligence instead of fearing it. Friends, Kira repeated the word like she was testing an unfamiliar concept. Captain Chen, I haven't had a friend since my grandmother died. I don't remember how to be anything other than a diplomatic representative. Then maybe it's time to learn. For the first time since the breakthrough in their relationship came 3 days after Kira's admission about her exile, when David found her in the station's memorial garden at 0300 hours, sitting on a bench and staring at the memorial wall with tears streaming down her face. Kira. David approached carefully, noting how she didn't immediately wipe away the tears or try to hide her emotional state. Are you all right? Today would have been my grandmother's birthday, she said quietly. I used to send her messages on this day, telling her about my diplomatic assignments and the people I was meeting. She always said she was proud that I could understand others so well. David sat beside her on the bench, close enough to offer comfort but not so close as to make her feel trapped. What would you have told her about this assignment? That I finally understand why she chose isolation over emotional reconditioning. Kira's voice carried a strength that hadn't been there before. She could have undergone the procedures that would have made her acceptable to Valnari society. Instead, she chose to remain herself, even if it meant dying alone. Do you think she regretted that choice? No. She used to tell me that losing the ability to love was worse than losing the ability to live. Kira turned to face David, her golden eyes reflecting the memorial garden's soft lighting. I never understood what she meant until now. And now? Now I realize that I've been slowly dying for 3 years, trying to become acceptable to people who will never accept me as I am. Kira's expression grew resolute. David, I need to tell you something important. I'm listening. The Valnari High Council has decided that my assignment here has failed to provide the therapeutic benefit they hoped for. Kira's voice was steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. I received word today that I'm being recalled for mandatory emotional reconditioning. David felt ice flow through his veins. When? The transport arrives in 6 days. And if you refuse to go? Then I become a rogue agent, stripped of all diplomatic immunity and protection. I would be alone in a galaxy with no legal status, no resources, and no way to return home even if the reconditioning were reversed. David stared at her, understanding the impossible choice she faced. Kira, what do you want to do? I want to run. I want to disappear into the outer systems where no one would think to look for a disgraced Valnari diplomat. Her laugh was bitter. But I've spent 3 years representing species that trusted me to negotiate in good faith. I can't abandon my responsibilities just because I'm afraid of losing myself. What if you didn't have to choose between responsibility and freedom? There is no alternative, David. The Valnari government has made their decision, and the other governments represented here won't interfere in internal Valnari affairs. David was quiet for a moment, then made a decision that would change both their lives. What if you weren't representing the Valnari government anymore? I don't understand. What if you were representing yourself? As an independent mediator with expertise in interspecies relations? David turned to face her fully. Kira, Crossroads Station needs someone with your skills on a permanent basis. Someone who understands that successful diplomacy requires emotional intelligence, not just strategic thinking. You're talking about defecting from my own people. I'm talking about choosing a future where you can use your gifts instead of being punished for them. Kira was quiet for a long time, staring at the memorial wall where names of beings from dozens of species were engraved in honor of their sacrifice for peace. David, if I stay here, if I refuse recall, I will never be able to go home. I will never see my homeworld again, never speak my native language with someone who truly understands its nuances, never participate in the cultural ceremonies that shaped my childhood. Her voice grew heavy with the weight of permanent loss. I will be truly alone in the universe. You won't be alone, David said softly. You'll have friends who value exactly who you are. You'll have work that uses your empathy as a strength rather than treating it as a weakness. You'll have a community that appreciates what you can offer instead of trying to fix what they think is broken. A community of one person. A community that starts with one person and grows from there. Kira, you're not the only being in the galaxy who's been displaced by cultures that don't understand them. You could help others find their way, just like someone is helping you find yours. Kira stood and moved to the memorial wall, tracing names with her fingertip. All of these beings died for the cause of peace between species. What kind of peace am I serving if I abandon my people entirely? The kind that recognizes that some divisions can't be bridged, and that sometimes serving peace means choosing truth over loyalty. David joined her at the memorial wall. Kira, your people don't want peace with other species, they want dominance that looks like peace. They sent you away because you actually achieved what they claim to value. And you think I should build a new life based on that rejection? I think you should build a new life based on who you really are, not on who they tried to make you become. David touched her shoulder gently. The choice isn't between loneliness and belonging, Kira. It's between being alone while pretending to be someone else, or being yourself while building genuine connections. She turned to face him, tears still visible on her cheeks but her expression growing stronger. David, there's something else you should know. If I refuse recall, if I claim asylum here, the Valnari government will consider anyone who supports me to be interfering in their internal affairs. Meaning your diplomatic career could be destroyed simply for offering me friendship. David smiled, feeling a clarity he hadn't experienced since arriving at Crossroads Station. Then it's a good thing my diplomatic career isn't as important to me as doing what's right. You would risk everything for someone you've known for less than a week. I would risk everything for someone who spent 3 years sacrificing herself to maintain peace between species that would be at war without her mediation. David moved closer to her. Kira, you've been alone for so long that you've forgotten what it feels like to have someone willing to stand with you. But I'm telling you right now, you don't have to make this choice by yourself. For the first time since he'd known her, Kira reached out voluntarily, taking his hand in both of hers. Her touch was warm, and he could feel the slight tremor that spoke of emotions too long suppressed finally being allowed expression. David, I'm terrified. Not of the Valnari government or of losing my diplomatic status. I'm terrified of hoping that this could actually work. Hope is scary when you've been without it for a long time. What if I'm too damaged? What if 3 years of emotional suppression has broken something essential in me? Her golden eyes searched his face desperately. What if I try to build a new life and discover that I've forgotten how to be genuinely happy? Then we'll figure it out together. One day at a time, one emotion at a time, one genuine connection at a time. David squeezed her hands gently. Kira, you haven't forgotten how to be happy, you've just been forbidden from showing it. There's a difference. She was quiet for a long moment, and David could see her wrestling with years of conditioning that told her emotional expression was dangerous, warring with the desperate need to finally be honest about what she felt. David, she said finally, if I stay, if I claim asylum and request independent status, will you help me learn how to be myself again? I'll help you remember that you never stopped being yourself. You just learned to hide it so well that even you forgot it was there. Kira smiled then, not the diplomatic courtesy he'd grown accustomed to, but an expression of genuine joy mixed with terror and hope and relief all tangled together in a way that was beautifully, honestly human. Then I choose to stay. I choose to refuse recall and request asylum as an independent cultural mediator. Her voice grew stronger with each word. I choose to believe that being truly seen is worth the risk of losing everything I thought I was. And I choose to stand with you, whatever comes next. They remained in the memorial garden for another hour, talking about practical arrangements and emotional fears and the strange mixture of grief and excitement that came with choosing an unknown future over a prescribed past. When they finally returned to their quarters, David reflected on how much had changed in just 1 week. He'd arrived at Crossroads Station expecting The Valnari transport arrived precisely on schedule, its sleek design reflecting the same aesthetic perfection that characterized everything about Kira's people. David stood with Station Administrator Walsh in the docking bay control room, watching through the viewports as three figures in the flowing robes of Valnari officialdom disembarked. "Those aren't just diplomatic escorts," Walsh observed, reviewing the manifest. "That's a full psychological intervention team. They came prepared to take her whether she agrees or not." David felt his stomach tighten. "On what authority?" "Mental health custody protocols. If they can demonstrate that she's psychologically compromised, they have the right to override her personal autonomy for her own protection." Walsh's expression was grim. "David, they're not just here to collect her. They're here to prove she's mentally incompetent." In her quarters, Kira was preparing for what might be her final official act as a Valnari diplomat. She had dressed in her formal robes with meticulous care, her silver hair arranged in the traditional diplomatic style, her golden eyes reflecting a calm that David knew was costing her tremendous effort to maintain. "How do you feel?" David asked as they made their way to the meeting room where the intervention team waited. "Terrified. Hopeful. Determined." Kira's voice was steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. "David, whatever happens in there, I want you to know that these past few days have been the first time in years that I've felt like myself. Whatever happens, we face it together." The meeting room felt charged with tension as they entered. The three Valnari officials stood in perfect formation: Dr. Thane Velsoar, the lead psychological evaluator, Commander Lyra Veldan, the diplomatic authority, and Healer Zara Velthran, the medical specialist who would oversee Kira's treatment if she were declared incompetent. Ambassador Velthara, Dr. Velsioar began without preamble, "You have failed to report for mandatory psychological evaluation. This constitutes a violation of your diplomatic service obligations." "I have fulfilled every requirement of my assignment here," Kira replied, her diplomatic training evident in her composed response. "My psychological state is not relevant to my professional performance." "Your psychological state is the primary concern, given the reports we have received about your behavior." Commander Veldan activated a data display showing 3 years of surveillance reports. "You have demonstrated persistent emotional attachment to non-Valnari individuals, excessive concern for alien welfare, and disturbing levels of empathic response to other species' emotional states." David watched Kira's face as her own people systematically catalogued every moment of genuine emotion she'd shown in 3 years, presenting her capacity for empathy as evidence of mental illness. "Furthermore, Dr. Velsior continued, recent reports indicate that you have formed an inappropriate personal relationship with Captain Chen, demonstrating that your condition has worsened rather than improved during your therapeutic assignment." "My relationship with Captain Chen is professional and within appropriate diplomatic boundaries," Kira said, but David could see the strain in her posture. "Our surveillance indicates otherwise. You have been observed engaging in non-essential social interaction, expressing personal emotions, and displaying concern for his welfare that exceeds professional requirements." Healer Velthren stepped forward. "Ambassador, these behaviors indicate severe emotional dysregulation that requires immediate intervention." David felt anger building in his chest as he watched 3 people who claimed to care about Kira's welfare systematically attack her for every moment of genuine human connection she'd experienced. With respect, David interjected, "The behaviors you're describing sound like friendship and professional competence, not mental illness." "Captain Chen," Commander Veldan's tone was coldly dismissive, "your opinion on Valnari psychological standards is neither requested nor relevant." "Then perhaps you'd like to hear from the 17 species representatives who have submitted formal statements praising Ambassador Velthara's diplomatic effectiveness." David pulled out his own data display. "Or the peace accords that have prevented 3 wars specifically because of her ability to understand and address the emotional needs of conflicting parties." "Emotional manipulation is not legitimate diplomacy," Dr. Velsior replied. "Ambassador Velthara's methods demonstrate dangerous contamination by alien emotional patterns." David saw Kira flinch at the word contamination and realized they were attacking the very core of her identity as both a diplomat and a person. Kira, he said quietly, you don't have to listen to this. Ambassador Velthara will submit to psychological evaluation and remedial treatment, Commander Veldan declared. Her condition has clearly deteriorated beyond the point where voluntary compliance can be expected. No. The word came from Kira, spoken so quietly that everyone in the room had to strain to hear it. But the force behind it was unmistakable. I said no. Kira stood, her diplomatic composure finally giving way to 3 years of suppressed anger and pain. I refuse evaluation. I refuse treatment. I refuse to return with you. Ambassador, you are not competent to make that decision, Dr. Velsior said, moving toward her with the kind of clinical detachment that suggested he'd performed this type of intervention before. I am competent enough to know that I would rather die as myself than live as the emotionally neutered shell you want to make me. Kira's voice grew stronger with each word. I formally renounce my position as a Vailnari diplomatic representative and request political asylum as an independent cultural mediator. The room fell silent except for the hum of the station's life support systems. The 3 Vailnari officials looked at each other with the kind of calculating expressions that suggested they'd prepared for this possibility. Very well, Commander Veldan said finally. If you insist on proving your incompetence through public rejection of rational treatment, we will comply with standard protocols for dealing with mentally compromised individuals. What protocols? David asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. Involuntary commitment for emergency psychological intervention. Ambassador Velthara's rejection of treatment is itself evidence of her compromised mental state. David stepped protectively closer to Kira. She's requesting asylum. You have no authority to. We have authority to protect a Vailnari citizen from her own psychological dysfunction, regardless of her current location. Dr. Velsoar activated what appeared to be some kind of restraint device. Ambassador, please do not make this more difficult than necessary. That's when David spoke the words that changed everything. Kira, he said, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, you look lonely. The simple statement, the same observation he'd made when they first really saw each other, hit Kira like a revelation. All the careful diplomatic training, all the cultural conditioning, all the desperate attempts to maintain emotional control fell away as she finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of 3 years of isolation and rejection. She collapsed into David's arms without saying a word, silent tears streaming down her face as she finally let herself be vulnerable in front of the people who had spent her entire life telling her that vulnerability was weakness. The Vailnari officials stared in shock at this display of raw, honest emotion, not the controlled diplomatic courtesy they were accustomed to, but genuine human connection that couldn't be categorized